cool, daddy-o. Beatniks, hipsters, angel-headed hipsters for that matter. Yep, that's where we're going today, daddy-o, on episode 48 of the He Mistook Her for Swan emergency broadcasting system, brought to you for the 48th straight week by the plague. It is National Sleep in Public Day, and it's also John Fahey's birthday. These things are completely unrelated. Don't confuse them, okay? So, National Sleep in Public Day. I gotta say, for the last frickin' 25 years, I have been commuting to work probably a good 2.5, even 3 hours a day. And I don't miss it one fucking little bit. But there was probably a certain amount of sleeping in public. You know, after a late night, maybe I had a gig, maybe I'm just beat. You know, you close your eyes and then boom, you went past your stop. Fuck. I don't miss that at all. More satisfying kind of sleeping in public, which I'm looking forward to doing, is like, you know, it's 90 degrees out, right? It's sunny. You grab your towel, you got your trunks on, you go down to the beach, you roll your towel out, you throw your baseball cap over your eyes, and you just lay down and soak it up and have a little snooze. That is very satisfying sleeping in public, and I am looking forward to doing that a bit this year. John Fahey, born on this day in 1939, ranked the 35th greatest guitar player of all time by Rolling Stones magazine. Okay? Not Rolling Stones magazine, Rolling Stone magazine, okay? Let's get that straight right off the get-go. Anyway, super influential. He invented and named a school of guitar playing, and he called it American Primitive. And he kind of named it after, you know, the painting school of the primitivists. But really, there's not too much primitive about the School of American Primitive Guitar Playing, and there's a whole bunch of other guys that followed in his footsteps and were part of this school. Leo Kottke and Harry Tossig and a bunch of really, really cool guitar players. Pretty much it's instrumental music, and it's very much based on blues roots. But then they've added kind of jazz and world music and stuff from all over the world. Anyway, it's magical, it's complex, it's soulful. Just go listen to some John Fahey stuff. Like, listen to Requiem for Mississippi John Hurt. That's one of his favorites. I've been trying to learn it for the last 2 years. I kind of got the idea, but it's complicated, man. But it's just freaking beautiful. I think we have to acknowledge today, since it is our Beatnik episode, the passing of the last of one of the great beats from the Beat generation, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Passed away this week, 102 years old. Anarchist, pacifist, poet, rabble-rouser. He was the guy who he's the founder, proprietor of City Lights Books in San Francisco. And it's basically the home of the Beat generation. Now, Ferlingetti wrote some amazing books of poetry. My favorite is Coney, Island of the Mind, and it's also a lot of other people's favorite because it is one of the best-selling books of poetry of all time. And it's not that it's simplistic, but it's easy to read. It's an easy doorway into that kind of poetry, and it's just fantastic. You know, just look some up. You know, you can read it on the interweb. It's great. So Ferlingetti really didn't consider himself a Beat. He said, you know, I was there before the Beats and I was there after the Beats. But he will forever be associated with the Beats because Ferlingetti was the first one who was brave enough to publish Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl. Remember Howl? I saw the greatest minds of my generation destroyed by madness. It sends chills up your spine just reading that whole long poem by Ginsberg. So as soon as Ferlingetti published it, boom, he was charged with obscenity and he had to go on trial, and he fought it and he won. In 1957, he won the trial. And they never looked back, man. So Ferlingetti, yeah, he nurtured the Beat generation. It's funny, he says, even as he was getting older, he says, you know, you're supposed to get more conservative as you age. But I seem to be going in just the opposite direction. Like he got more radical. He was just like the heart and soul of Beat San Francisco. So Lawrence Ferlinghetti, thank you for everything. Hope you're on an exciting new trip now, and we're going to talk about the beats and the folkies right now. Crazy Daddy-O. Jack Kerouac. Remember Jack? On the Road, Dharma Bums, all that great stuff. He invented the phrase beat generation back in 1948 to describe this new underground nonconformist movement that he was pretty much coming up with by himself, like him and a couple of his buddies. And they rejected the social conservatism of the times. They rejected the sexual conservatism of the times. They were interested in new styles of writing, of new ways of expressing themselves. They were into spiritualism. They were into dope. Oh, holy moly. And they had this kind of romantic idea that it would be a fantastic idea to hop in cars and just roar around the countryside and go from New York to San Francisco and experience America in ways that nobody had experienced it before. So basically, that's the beat generation. Now, Kerouac took the word beat. It was kind of a street slang word that just meant tired or beaten down, down and out. And he twisted it around, he made it work for him. So he kept the original meaning, but he added a few more things, that kind of, other connotations like upbeat and beatific. And also there's the the notion of beat in terms of music, because these guys were really interested in the new bebop music that was coming out by guys like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk in the late 40s and early 50s. And, they kind of saw themselves as part of this whole revolutionary change that was happening in America. And in music, those guys, Charlie Parker and those guys, were doing their bit. And in terms of writing and poetry, Kerouac and Ginsberg and Burroughs, they were going to do their part. So it was all a part of this thing that was happening. So in terms of the American experience, these guys were kind of way out there, right? Now, on the other hand, the books like On the Road and poems like Howl eventually became pretty successful. And it kind of made this social kind of movement, not a movement, but a fad in a sense. So the word beatnik was not invented until 1958 and was invented by this guy who worked on the San Francisco Chronicle, Herb Caen. And he was just doing his job, and Look magazine was throwing a party, and they were throwing a party to do a spread on San Francisco's beat generation. And he goes, oh no, not again. So obviously it's already a bore, right? And it's got a lot of posers and phonies and fakes. So anyway, there's this party. So they throw this party, and they throw it for like 50 Beatniks. So that is the first time anybody used the word beatnik. So Herb Caen invented it. Give him credit for that. So he said after that, word got around, and before you know it, 250 bearded cats and kits were there slopping up the free booze. Okay, so basically he took the word beat, Kerouac's word beat, and he added nick on the end of it, which is kind of a Yiddish, kind of Slavic word. The thing is, just about 6 months before that, Russia had just launched the Sputnik into orbit. And that was the first thing that was ever in orbit, basically. And so everything was nick this and nick that, no good nicks. And so Beatniks just came out of his typewriter, and it became a word. So Allen Ginsberg just hated this. He immediately saw that this was a media creation, and it described everything he hated, phonies and posers and stuff. Kerouac also hated it. These guys did not, they hated the word beatnik, but anyway, they were kind of stuck with it, eh? So back in New York, let's go back to New York, the folk scene, okay? So I remember reading in this book by this guy, Dave Van Ronk. I've mentioned his name a bunch of times already in previous episodes. So Dave Van Ronk wrote this book called The Mayor of McDougal Street. And it was basically a history of the early folk scene in New York City. And it's a great history. This book is the model that the Coen brothers used for their Llewyn Davis movie, which is a pretty good movie too. It's basically the life of Dave Van Ronk, that movie. So anyway, I remember that Dave Van Ronk just didn't like the beats. He didn't like the beatniks. So I thought, why is that? These people kind of overlapped in time. They shared the same time and place. They shared the same clubs, with inadequate plumbing and so on, and crappy food. So like they were on top of each other. There was probably intermingling. There may have been some canoodling. There may have been some folkniks created during that time. So I went back and reread why he didn't like the Beats. And it kind of makes sense to me now. Because basically he said there were some guys and women who were into the beat movement who he totally respected. They were smart, they were into politics, they knew jazz. You could have a really great conversation with them. They were well read and they were okay. But on the other hand, he says, if you weren't there, you might not understand this. But back in the day, there were these other guys that called themselves Beatniks. And he said, they're the same self-conscious young boors who 20 years later were sticking safety pins in their cheeks and dyeing their hair green. And we just despised them. They were just fakes and phonies. They were posers. And also the problem was down in the village there where the folk scene was being created, it started to become a tourist attraction. And tourists came down just to gawk at the Beatniks. Now, I get this, because I remember people coming down to gawk at the punks, and mostly the punks they were gawking at were people who we didn't have a lot of respect for. They were the same posers and fakes and phonies. So Dave Van Ronk, he's remembering that, it was so fake that just for a couple of bucks, you could hire some goof to come to one of your parties, in your Ponce neighborhood, and he would show up and have like a beard and a beret and some bongos. He said those are the three B's, and he would go to your party and say wow and far out and shit like that, and occasionally taking a feckless thwack at a bongo, and apparently it was a little cottage industry. Rent a beatnik. The rich folks wanted to have like some cool and groovy beatnik guy to show up at their party, and I get that. I totally get this now in that context, is that these people were just fakes and phonies. So who the frick needs that? Anyway, the problem is, in the public mind, the Beats and the folk guys were the same guy. What about that riot? Give me a minute while I interview my brain on that one. It's the spring of 1961, Washington Square Park in New York City, a stone's throw away from the village, okay? People have been playing music in Washington Square Park forever, okay? But lately, it's kind of been a destination for the folk revival folks who like to just grab their guitars and their auto harps and their banjos and walk the 2 or 3 blocks over and sit down and, sing some songs. What's the harm? Well, apparently, some of the local real estate moguls and a few other hoity-toity people have decided that these are undesirable elements. So one weekend, they apply for a permit to, have a little concert in the park, and their permit's denied. Well, they're flummoxed. Why did this happen? Our permit's never denied. We're just playing some songs. So this guy, Izzy Young, who is the proprietor of the Folklore Center, which is kind of the ground zero. It's the meeting place. It's the dropout center for the folk revival folks. He organizes a little protest, and they get a couple hundred people, and they walk over to Washington Square Park. And this whole thing is filmed. You can see it on YouTube. I'll put a little link to it for you. But these people, all these youngsters, young men and women in their horn-rimmed glasses, so earnest, clutching their auto harps. They're so harmless and helpless. And they go to the park and they are confronted by a wall of blue. The New York City's finest is not going to let them play music in Washington Square Park. Well, what the fuck? So these guys, they're unhappy about this, and you can see them, that some of these feckless little guys and gals, the police are confronting them, and they're trying to talk back, and basically they say, talk to Izzy. Izzy's the guy. So Izzy walks up to the front and he just lambastes these cops, and he says, it is our God-given right to sing music. We'll sing music wherever the fuck we want. And why did you deny our permit? And the cops are really having none of this either. And eventually this actually erupts into some pushing and shoving and stuff, and a bunch of people are arrested, thrown into the paddy wagons, taken downtown. There's a great image of this guy just clutching his auto harp. This poor young man, has probably never been in trouble in his entire life, and he thinks, this is America. I can sing folk songs wherever I want. Well, wrong. You cannot, because it's not exactly what you thought it was it? So here's the dealio. The next day in the paper, this thing is touted as the Beatnik Riot. Well, from what I just said, they're probably a little pissed. They're going, we don't even like the Beatniks. Why are you calling it the Beatnik Riot? Cut it out. We got to talk about Dave Van Ronk. Dave Van Ronk, not exactly a household name. He didn't have any big hits. He made a lot of records. And he was so influential in everything that happened in the New York Folk Revival in the 50s and 60s. Born in New York, born in Brooklyn, actually, in 36. He was a bear of a man, well over 6 feet tall, not scrawny. If you were in a barroom brawl, you wanted Dave on your team. He started off with an interest in jazz, especially that kind of old-timey jazz, and he would sit in with all the greats, that were jamming around New York City in those days. But eventually he was completely won over to the folk music and the blues music that he started hearing in the 50s. He didn't finish high school, but he had just this voracious appetite for learning. So he became extremely knowledgeable about all this folk music, and he developed a really great folk guitar style, and he had a fantastic singing voice. He had perfect sense of timing and delivery, and he made all these really good records that really they're mostly covers of old folk songs, and he influenced so many people, as I said. So just to name a couple, he influenced Joan Baez, who just worshipped him. Joni Mitchell, who said he was a great influence. And Joni actually says Dave's version of Both Sides Now is the best version ever done. Ian and Sylvia, he helped them out. He was like the elder statesman of the folk scene there. He was a little bit older than, the youngsters that were coming in. He knew a lot of stuff. He had experience in the world. He was a merchant marine, like he worked on ships a lot. So he was, a burly guy, a bit of a curmudgeon, but in the end, it's the curmudgeons that you really want to know. You don't want to know the flakes. When you get to know the curmudgeons, they can be your best friends for life. So the other person we got to mention is Bob Dylan. So Dylan said when he moved to New York, it was Dave Van Ronk that mentored him, and he said Dave was the one performer that he wanted to learn all the particulars from. And he said even when he was back in the Midwest in Minnesota, he heard Van Ronk's records, and he thought they were so great that he copied them, like phrase for phrase, okay? And he said Van Ronk could howl and turn the blues into ballads and the ballads into blues. Bob loved his style. And he said basically Greenwich Village and Dave were like almost the same thing for him. Dave's got some interesting stories about Bob. Bob was kind of, sometimes says that he moved to New York City to make it. Dave says that can't be true. Nobody was making it. Like the only thing you could do in New York City as a folk musician in the early days was starve, right? But he says the real reason he thinks Bob came to New York City was so he could be closer to Woody Guthrie. And he said every week Bob would go out there to the hospital where Woody was dying of Huntington's disease, and sit there and try to communicate with Woody and to learn from him and to talk to him and to get some knowledge and just to be his friend. And Dave basically says from that point on, Bob could do no wrong. You know, Bob was a stand-up guy. It turns out Bob actually covered or took Dave's arrangements of a lot of songs on his first records. Bob apparently took Dave's arrangement of House of the Rising Sun. And from Bob, it went to the Animals. So, you know, basically you draw that line. But, you know, Dave never really got any credit or money from it. Dave just always seems to be, you know, in the middle of shit, you know. He was actually one of the only 13 people who were arrested at the famous Stonewall riots in 1969. Dave wasn't gay, but he was there and he was standing up for the rights of those people. So good on Dave. He was a lifetime member of the International Workers of the World, the IWW. Dave was a wobbly. Okay, so Dave is a pretty left-wing guy. He was hanging out with Trotskyists and stuff, but you know he was trying to play music in you know little folk clubs in New York in the early days. He met up with Odetta, the famous woman folk singer, and she came up to him after a show and said, you know, are you going to be a professional folk singer? And Dave said, nah, no, not really. You know, I'm going to ship out on a boat soon. And Odetta said, man, that's too bad. You're really good. You should do it. So he gets this idea in his mind, and somebody says, hey, you should make a demo tape and send it over to Albert Grossman over in Chicago. Albert turned out to be Bob's manager later on. So it's hard to make a demo tape in those days, in the 50s. You know, it's tough. Nowadays, anybody can make a demo tape. All you need is like a frickin' phone. But in those days, it was tough, but he did it. And he made a demo tape, mailed it off. He's waiting for his ship to come in, so to speak. Nothing happened. So what he does, he just he puts on his coat, sticks out his thumb, and he hitchhikes to Chicago. He gets to Chicago at Albert's club there, and Albert never got the tape. But he says, okay, well, you're here anyway, so play me some songs, you know, do a little audition for me. So Dave Van Ronk sits down there on the stage at Albert Grossman's club and plays him some tunes. And basically Grossman says, why should I hire you? You know, I can hire Muddy Waters. I can hire Big Bill Brunsey. I can hire Big Joe Turner. Why should I hire you? Well, Dave is just pissed at this. So he puts his coat back on, he sticks his thumb back out, and he's going to go back to New York. He's got his merchant marine papers, and he's going to get on a ship, and he's just going to forget this whole fucking folk stuff. Well, on his way back, he gets picked up by these teenagers, and they all start drinking bourbon, and Dave, he basically passes out. He says, I went down like the Hindenburg. So when he woke up, they had stolen his papers. So Dave's thinking, fuck, I'm never going to get those papers back because, you know, I've got too many communist friends. It's the 50s. They're not going to give me my papers back. And so that's how he became a folk singer. Basically, he had no other choice. And as it turns out, years later, through the Freedom of Information stuff, the FBI files on Dave Van Ronk came out. And sure enough, they were keeping tabs on him and his wife. And there is no way he would have gotten those papers anyway. So there you go. So the rest is history. He was so influential, he was supposed to be one of the guys in Peter, Paul, and Mary. Like it was going to be Dave, Paul, and Mary. But he turned them down. He's just got this huge range of influences and knowledge. And it not just about music, but he put out a record of sea shanties. Now, that's cool. He did that song, Lever Johnny, that we did. He's on that compilation of The Unfortunate Rake. He did a version of one of those Unfortunate Rake songs, you know, that ended up being The Streets of Laredo. He put out a record of Kurt Weill and Bertold Brecht songs. You know, that's odd, isn't it? But see, he's just got this encyclopedic knowledge of music and a wide range of interests. So, like, he was never a big financial success. He did write this cool book called The Mayor of McDougal Street about all his experiences in the early folk scene and, you know, his growing up and, you know, where he came from. Basically, Dave Van Ronk, fucking soul brother. His heart's in the right place. He helped so many people. The world would have been a different place without him. So, here's to you, Dave. Dave did this blues song called Come Back Baby. A lot of people have done it. You know, but he does a beautiful version of it. So I'm going to try and do his version of it, more or less. I'll add my own shit in a little bit too. And you guys be good. You take care and keep yourselves out of jail. And we'll talk to you next week. All right? Bye. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come back, baby. Mama, please don't go. The way I love you, baby, you never know. Come back, baby. Let's talk about it one more time. I love you, baby. Lord knows I do. Don't want nobody else in this world but you. Come back, baby. Let's talk about it one more time. Lonesome train, mean engineer, took my baby, left me standing here. Come back, baby, let's talk about it one more time. If I could holler like a mountain jack, climb that mountain, call my baby back. Come back, baby, let's talk about it one more time. Love you, baby, Lord knows I do. Don't want nobody else in this world but you. Come back, baby, let's talk about it. Please don't go. Come back, baby, mama, please don't go. The way I love you, baby, you never know. Come back, baby, let's talk about it one more time, one more time.